In fiction, the Victorian era is often portrayed as a period of demureness, and Queen Victoria herself is usually shown having puritanical tendencies. While Queen Victoria is often thought of as prim and prudish, in reality, she was actually quite fond of sex and had a deep appreciation for the naked human form. Oh my. Today, we're going to take a look at some unusual facts you never knew about Queen Victoria. Although she was often depicted as uptight, Queen Victoria was reportedly quite comfortable with the human figure. In fact, an exhibit of the paintings the royal couple gifted to one another revealed that Victoria's tastes were actually more erotic than her husband Albert's. While his tastes ran closer to the demure, Victoria gave her husband several paintings that featured bare flesh, including William Edward Frost's Una Among the Fawns and Wood Nymphs at the Disarming of Cupid, as well as Franz Xaver's Winterhalter's Florinda. She also commissioned an intimate portrait of herself, now known as The Secret Picture, which was made to be seen only by the prince. While it might not look particularly tantalizing to us, Victoria's languid pose, her far-off unfocused gaze, and her free-flowing hair would have been considered fairly risque at the time. When she had her first child, Vicky, Victoria was awestruck by the miracle of birth, telling her ladies-in-waiting, "It seems like a dream having a child." However, her opinion on babies and children changed as the years passed. And to be fair, you probably wouldn't be raving about the joys of pregnancy and motherhood either, if you delivered 9 children in under 17 years. Victoria's attitude changed so much when a newly married Vicky expressed her joy at the thought of being a mother. The Queen told her daughter, "I think much more of our being like a cow or a dog at such moments, when our poor nature becomes so very animal and unecstatic." Points for honesty, at least. She also expressed her disgust about marriage, saying, "The poor woman is bodily and morally the husband's slave." That always sticks in my throat. Not the rosiest picture of marriage, but again, you have to respect the honesty. Hemophilia has been referred to as the royal disease. We have a video on it, and you should check it out, because it was passed down to a number of European ruling families through Queen Victoria. It is a rare inherited disease that affects blood's ability to clot. Victoria's son Leopold had hemophilia, and 2 of her daughters were carriers. Her daughter Beatrice, who married into the Spanish ruling family, passed the gene to Spain's male heir. One of Victoria's other daughters, Alice, had a daughter who was a carrier of the disease also, and passed it on to Russia's male heir to the throne. Sometimes in life and love, you get more than you bargain for. We also did a whole video on this, but just to recap, during the course of her reign, Queen Victoria was attacked on at least 7 separate occasions by madmen, some of whom may have harbored unhealthy fascinations with the Queen. Many of these attempts happened while she was traveling in her carriage, and at least 4 of the attempts involved a gun. Although several shots were fired at Victoria, she made it through each attempt physically unscathed, with one exception. On the evening of June 27, 1850, as Victoria and 3 of her children were on their way back to Buckingham Palace, a well-dressed man approached the royal carriage and struck Victoria in the head with his cane. Apparently, the blow was so strong that it crushed the Queen's bonnet and drew some blood. The Queen, however, was fine. She even called the attacker out for hitting a woman and implied he was a coward compared to the braver would-be assassins who had tried shooting her. As part of their efforts to control the future royal heir, Victoria's mother and Sir John Conroy developed a disciplinary regime called the Kensington System, which limited young Victoria's freedom and kept her under constant supervision. It ensured that Victoria would be accompanied by someone at all times. And we really mean all times. Her mother slept beside her, and she wasn't even permitted to walk down the stairs without someone holding her hand. Absolutely all of her actions were controlled and monitored. However, despite always being in the company of others, she led a considerably isolated life. Her mother and Conroy limited her interactions with the rest of the royal family and almost never allowed her to meet other children. Their hope was that, through this strict regimen, the 2 adults would be able to control and manipulate Victoria once she was crowned. Unfortunately for them, they severely underestimated Victoria's resilience and willpower. The first 2 things Victoria asked for upon reaching the age of majority were an hour of complete solitude and her own bedroom. Since Victoria wasn't allowed to play with other children, she spent much of her time playing with her dolls. Nobody knows exactly how many dolls the Queen had, but it must have been a lot given that 132 of them have been preserved, and she played with them until she was 14 years old. The dolls themselves were plain, but the highly imaginative young Victoria dressed them in exquisitely crafted costumes that she made herself. The dolls' wardrobes were made of high-quality silk, expensive lace, and even small jewels. The young princess would dress the dolls as members of court, characters from plays and operas, and ballet dancers. One doll was even made to look like Queen Elizabeth I. There is a tradition of British monarchs taking a new name once they ascend the throne. For example, King George VI was born Albert Frederick Arthur George, but he chose to reign as King George. Queen Victoria's first name was actually Alexandrina, but she chose to reign as Victoria. It is said that she chose Victoria as her regal name as a sign of strength and a means of asserting her independence from her mother and Sir John Conroy. Growing up in a highly controlled environment didn't make Victoria herself any less controlling. In fact, quite the opposite. When it came to controlling her own children, Victoria pulled out all the stops, even going as far as to hire spies to watch over them and report back on their activities. She also wanted her youngest child, Beatrice, to remain unmarried and by her side for the remainder of her life. When Beatrice married, Victoria was seriously pissed off and refused to speak to her for nearly 6 months. While it would be pretty cool if Victoria proposed to Albert because she had a super progressive streak in her, the real reason she did had nothing to do with feminism or women's rights. It was because, as a sovereign, she had to. She warmly described the moment in her journal. At about 12:30, I sent for Albert. She goes on to describe how Albert arrived and, after a few presumably awkward minutes, she said that it would make her too happy if he would consent to marry her. To quote the Queen herself, "We embraced each other over and over again, and he was so kind, so affectionate. I really felt it was the happiest, brightest moment in my life." While Victoria wasn't the first royal to wear a white dress to her wedding, that honor goes to Queen Philippa, she was the royal who popularized it. Prior to Victoria, most wedding dresses were colorful, with red being a favorite at the time she married. Historically, women who chose to wear white on their wedding day did so not because it was a symbol of a woman's purity, which is a widely held misconception, but because it was a sign of one's wealth. During Victoria's time, ornate white fabric was highly valuable, and it was difficult and expensive to keep white garments clean. This is why many women wore colored gowns for their wedding. It was easier to hide the stains. However, that Victoria chose to wear white to show off her wealth isn't a foregone conclusion. Some scholars argue that the Queen actually wore white as a sign of support for the working-class lace workers. Handmade lace was swiftly becoming replaced with factory-produced lace, and many textile workers found themselves unemployed. By choosing a white dress, Victoria was able to more prominently showcase the intricate lace of her dress and make a statement. There's some debate about the life expectancy during the Victorian period, but most studies place the average death age between the late 30s and the late 50s. Queen Victoria, stubborn as she was, lived until the age of 81, reigning for an astounding 63 years. In addition to outliving her husband Albert, she outlived 3 of her children. The first of her children to die was Princess Alice, who passed away after she caught diphtheria from her son. It's said that she caught the infection after she kissed her son Ernest, who had the disease. She was consoling him after the death of one of her daughters who had died of the illness weeks before. Victoria's son Leopold died when he suffered from a cerebral hemorrhage after he slipped and fell. He was in Cannes, France at the time, sent there by his doctor because the warm weather was better for his joint pain, which was caused by his hemophilia. The last of Victoria's children to die before her was Prince Alfred, the Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. He died of throat cancer at the age of 55. It's always sad when a child dies before their parent, but given the life expectancy at the time, he didn't do so bad. Queen Victoria outlived her husband Albert, who died at the age of 42 after a 2-year-long illness. At the time, doctors diagnosed him with a violent case of typhoid fever, but modern doctors disagree. Today's science points to the conclusion that he actually may have been suffering from Crohn's disease. Whatever the cause, Albert's death took its toll on Victoria, who fell into a deep depression. She was so sad about it that she even refused to make a public appearance for nearly 3 years. The expected period of mourning during the Victorian era was a year, but Victoria, as usual, pushed the limits. She mourned the loss of her husband for the rest of her life, wearing black for her remaining 40 years. She also ordered that Albert's rooms stay exactly as he had left them, instructing her servants to lay out fresh clothes for her husband every day, in addition to replacing the water in his basin for washing. Given how lonely her childhood was, it's not too hard to understand why. Whether we're talking stately period films, moody mystery novels, or gritty television series, the Victorian era is heavily represented in pop culture. Despite that representation, it's still one of the most misunderstood periods in history, thanks to persistent myths about everything from extreme prudishness to a cold and loveless queen. So, today we're going to debunk some popular myths about the Victorian era. Lasting from 1837 until 1901, the Victorian era was the period of Queen Victoria's rule over the United Kingdom. It was an era in which the United Kingdom headed a vast empire that generated both great wealth and great inequality. Honestly, it seems like most periods of British history involve great inequality. It's the great wealth part that all those Victoria heads celebrate. The Victorian era was a time of heightened morality and elaborate clothing. But at the same time, it was also an era of bawdy jokes, technological innovation, and amplified debates about human intimacy. Myths about the Victorian era, whether they stem from inaccurate readings of the past or popular fiction, tend to interpret the era in very limited terms. For instance, most of the steampunk genre is shockingly inaccurate. These myths and inaccuracies oversimplify a ridiculously complex historical era and its inhabitants. Back in the 1980s, Cyndi Lauper taught the world that girls just want to have fun. But she wasn't apparently thinking of Queen Victoria. Victoria was known to be dour, humorless, and sexless. In other words, a real drag. About as far from a party girl as anyone can be, at least according to the myths. In truth, Queen Victoria dearly loved her husband, Prince Albert. Her diary even details her wedding night with great enthusiasm. In fact, their union was so passionate that Victoria bore 9 children over the course of their 21-year marriage. Not only did she seem to enjoy physical intimacy, but she also apparently had quite the sense of humor. Her grandmother even described her as a comical, precocious clown. So why the myth? Well, the popular image of Queen Victoria as being stern and morose most likely stems from her later years. When her beloved Albert passed unexpectedly in 1861, she was consumed by grief and mourned for him the rest of her days, wearing only black clothing until her passing 40 years later. So in a sense, the myth has it backwards. She wasn't passionless, she was incredibly passionate, but only for her true love. Man, we don't have a joke here. That's just sad. Her role as the queen of a relatively moralistic nation and as a champion of family values also contributed to her association with prudishness. And though she is famously credited with quipping, "We are not amused," in response to a risque story, she later told her granddaughter that she never spoke those infamous words. It was apparently a let-them-eat-cake situation. The famous phrase everybody knows Marie Antoinette said, but actually Marie Antoinette did not say. We gotta stop misquoting these royals. Popular imaginings of Queen Victoria often paint her as being cold or even outright hateful toward her own children, which for some reason she had 9 of. And it is true that Victoria wasn't what you'd call an overly affectionate mother. She enforced high standards for her 9 children, and her relationships with many of them were, shall we say, prickly. But while she didn't enjoy pregnancy, and famously thought some infants were unsightly, she did not hate her children. Rather, she actually found much joy in them. So why do we think she hated her children? Well, Queen Victoria was forthright about the difficulties of raising kids, and the fact that her children's decisions sometimes disappointed her. A feeling that probably every parent can relate to at some level. She is also thought to have suffered from postnatal depression, which would explain her less than enthusiastic attitude toward pregnancy. Moreover, like many mothers of the upper classes in the 19th century, Victoria outsourced childcare and relied on nurses and governesses to raise her offspring. Her supposed lack of affection for her children is more related to assumptions about motherhood than her actual recorded feelings. Although she did have 9 kids. One of them must have been her favorite. Depictions in pop culture have given many the impression that Victorian parents kept their children at arm's length and typically relegated them to the sidelines of the family. They would have kept their kids in shoeboxes where their shoebox is big enough. But the reality was quite different. Victorians idealized childhood, believing children were innocents who needed to be protected from the corruption of the outside world. Children's literature, for example, exploded from the middle of the 18th century and into the 19th century, highlighting cultural shifts in how Britons perceived children and childhood. That being said, the Victorian romanticization of childhood was more of an ideal than a reality. Working-class children in particular faced extreme pressures. Unlike their upper-class counterparts, they often labored to help support their families and had to confront life's hardships at young ages. So how did the myth that Victorians were cold and indifferent toward their kids get started? Well, the care of children, especially in middle and upper-class families, was often entrusted to nurses and governesses. This reality kept the kids away from their parents and contributed to the myth. It could also have something to do with all the hardships endured by all those lower-class kids. Judging by most movies and television shows set in the Victorian era, everyone in England at the time was white and looked vaguely like Keira Knightley. But in reality, the United Kingdom had been racially diverse for centuries. Rome relied on soldiers from across its vast empire to staff forts and outposts in Britannia. And many of those soldiers were not Caucasian. People from around the world continued to come to the British Isles during the Victorian era, either willingly or unwillingly. For example, enslaved Africans had been brought to the UK by planters and government officials, and they didn't simply vanish once slavery was abolished throughout the empire in 1833. Many former slaves even stayed on working as domestic housekeepers and butlers. So how did these people get ignored by history? Well, following World War II, the UK recruited former colonial subjects to immigrate and ease the labor crisis. Popular memory assumes there was no racial diversity in the country before the arrival of these immigrants, who hailed from places such as Jamaica and India. And while the UK certainly became a more diverse country following the Second World War, non-white Victorians were a small, but by no means insignificant, part of British history. From reading the works of Charles Dickens and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, one would probably think that Victorian-era England had an opium den on every corner. Heck, even Sherlock Holmes was known to frequent them. He really knew how to kick back. Maybe that's why he's such a good detective. And in reality, illicit substances were widely available in Victorian Britain, as they often had medicinal uses and were found in common medications. Despite this availability, however, the country was not brimming with opium dens. Such establishments could be found around the docks of eastern London, but that was an exception rather than the rule. So why do we believe that Victorians were using drugs like their parents were out of town for the weekend? Well, dependency-inducing substances became increasingly taboo throughout the 19th century and eventually became associated with depravity and decay. Popular writers such as Charles Dickens seized upon this theme, and their fiction exaggerated the presence of opium dens in Britain. So it was really a matter of symbolism. Opium dens were everywhere in Victorian fiction because writers were trying to make a point about widespread depravity, sort of like how bad guys in westerns wear black hats. Some evil cowboys probably wore them, but man, black is bad in the heat. As we previously mentioned, Prince Albert was Queen Victoria's dearly beloved husband. Although she was the queen, he was seen as the moral center, both in the royal family and in the nation, with a personally held belief in strong family values. He was also, through no fault of his own, named Albert. That's a real hurdle to overcome. However, a Prince Albert is also the name given to an elaborate male genital piercing. Yeah, so why is the piercing named after Queen Victoria's husband? Yeah, no one really knows. Despite the obvious explanation, there is no evidence to support the notion that Prince Albert ever had any kind of genital piercing. So why the myth? Well, some claim Albert used a ring to confine his member while he wore form-fitting trousers, like he was posing for a Rolling Stones album cover. But the origin of this myth remains unknown. Popular fiction makes it seem like women of the Victorian era were all prim housewives and dutiful daughters who lived their lives in the domestic sphere, busily gunning to be a main character in the next Bronte sisters novel. The truth, however, is that Victorian women were heavily involved in the public sphere. Sure, women lacked many rights in the Victorian era, such as the right to vote, and they were legally subordinate to men. But women in the working classes supported themselves and their families, often through factory labor. Even middle-class and upper-class women did not always live within the confines of their home. Victorian women engaged in philanthropy, served as missionaries, published books, pursued scientific and technological advancements, and petitioned for their own political voice. So why do we think otherwise? Well, while it is true that gender roles were explicit in the Victorian era, these were perceived ideals rather than reflections of reality. The Angel in the House, a poem published in the middle of the 19th century, emphasized the idea that women were domestic beings. This so-called ideal of the housebound woman eventually wrought real-world implications. Many men and women used the model to justify women's exclusion from official forms of public life. Hey, it's hard to argue with, you can't vote because of the poem I like. Entire societies have been founded on that kind of logic. One of the most persistent images of the Victorian era is one of stuffy, humorless Lord Fauntleroy's sneering at the very idea of mirth. But nothing could be further from the truth. Victorians actually loved to laugh. This is evident through the bawdy humor of music halls and the jokes that eventually shaped Britain's uniquely dry humor. So why do we think the Victorians had no sense of humor? Well, weird history fans who saw our video about old photographs already know that people generally donned grim expressions in 19th century pictures simply because smiling hadn't yet become the standard pose. In fact, most people thought it kind of looked silly. We're just getting our picture taken. Why would you smile at a time like this? It's not fun. Scholars still haven't reached a consensus for the reasoning behind this custom. But several explanations persist, such as early cameras' relatively lengthy exposure time, or the belief that professional photographers sought to imitate the formal oil painting portraits of the previous century. Whatever the reason, the dour expressions in these old photos convinced modern viewers who didn't understand the context that the Victorians simply didn't smile or laugh. Victorians practiced some unusual customs during the mourning period for lost loved ones, such as preserving loved ones' hair in lockets and rings. But a popular misconception is that mourners would collect their own tears in glass vials. Not sure why you'd do that, in case you got thirsty during the service? In any event, tear collection was not a common practice in the Victorian era. So why do people think it was? Well, the discovery of small glass bottles in graves and tombs has persisted for centuries, going all the way back to the Greeks. The growing market for funerary objects has imagined these items as tear catchers, which added to their mystique and therefore their saleability. But the truth is, these bottles likely contained oils or perfumes rather than tears. Because in addition to being a final resting place for one's earthly remains, graves tend to be kind of smelly. Might as well throw a little brute in that hole to freshen things up. Okay, this one sounds like a joke, because it kind of is. But there is a persistent belief that Victorian-era Britons were so repressed that they actually covered the legs on their pianos, lest someone fall victim to the sexual wiles of the gigantic stringed instrument. We think of the Victorians as prudish, but in reality, Victorian Britain was anything but. Brothels catered to any and all preferences, and could be found throughout the country. Moreover, people engaged in intimate behavior both within and outside of their marriage. Despite this apparent openness, double standards surrounding male and female sexuality were present. Additionally, intimate activity was policed in various ways. People were discouraged from exploring their desires, and women were subject to harsh social consequences if they failed to embody the ideal of feminine purity. In other words, no adventurism in the bedroom. You keep that seaplane tied up at the dock. But where did these stories about the pianos come from? Well, the myth of Victorian prudishness was propagated by modernist writers of the early 20th century, like Virginia Woolf. These writers sought to critique Victorian understandings of intimacy and desire by depicting the seemingly backwards and buttoned-up attitudes of their parents and forebearers. Consequently, the idea that Victorians were so averse to sex that they covered up piano legs was likely based on a sarcastic joke, one that was aimed at Americans, which might be the only time in history that the British have made a joke for Americans rather than about Americans.
These days, if you're hungry, you just DoorDash a burrito and move on. But in Victorian times, well, let's just say it paid to keep an eye on the guy next to you. Yes, back then, when starvation set in, the line between roommate and ribeye got blurry. And to prove we've got the receipts, today we're taking a look at some cannibalism stories from the Victorian era. And now it's time to meal prep. In 1845, England was determined to find the fabled Northwest Passage, a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific that would make the nation rich and powerful, and anyone who traveled it very, very cold. To that end, they sent forth their best and brightest. And by brightest, we mean men who thought, hey, let's explore the Arctic in wool coats and optimism. Sounded like a good idea. 2 ships set sail, carrying 128 men under the command of Sir John Franklin, a seasoned explorer and national hero. And those ships, the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror, were considered state-of-the-art, complete with heating, libraries, and thousands of cans of preserved meat. Long story short, by 1846, both ships were locked in ice off King William Island. Temperatures dropped to -48 degrees Celsius. The men's skin blistered, their gums bled from scurvy, and at one point, it got so cold that taking off a mask could rip your beard clean off. Imagine dying and waxing at the same time. Anyway, for years, Britain heard nothing. 39 rescue expeditions were sent out, but all they found were eerie traces: tin cans, snow goggles, buttons, and bones. Dozens of bones. Many of them split open for marrow, because apparently, when the food runs out, so does the pretense of civilization. By the time rescuers pieced it together, every one of the crewmen was found dead from cold, starvation, scurvy, lead poisoning, or, menu expansion. Inuit witnesses later described mutilated bodies and cooking pots filled with, not soup. Forensic scientists confirmed it a century later: knife marks on human bones. Proof that the greatest Arctic expedition in British history ended with a coworker buffet. In 1846, 87 pioneers, including the Donner family, set out from Illinois for California. They had wagons, they had hope, they had absolutely no idea what was coming. Everything was going fine, until they took a detour called the Hastings Cutoff, a new shortcut promoted by a guy who had never actually taken it, because even then dudes refused to ask for directions. The trail was rough, slow, and involved hacking wagons through the Wasatch Mountains and slogging across the salt flats. It cost them precious weeks, burned through supplies, and put them dangerously behind schedule. By the time they reached the Sierra Nevada, it was late October, and a massive blizzard trapped them near what's now Donner Lake. And when we say trapped, we mean buried. Wagons were snowed under, livestock froze, people started dying. For 4 months, they were stranded. Some families holed up in makeshift cabins, others dug snow caves. They boiled hides into glue soup, gnawed on bones, chewed tree bark like sad beavers. Eventually, however, the food ran out, but the bodies didn't. The dead were eaten. Some accounts even claim that people were killed for meat. A small band of the strongest set out on snowshoes in a last-ditch attempt for help. 2 months later, rescuers finally reached the survivors, or what was left of them. Out of the original 87 people, just 46 had survived. Their ordeal became one of the most infamous survival stories in American history. It had everything: bad decisions, bad weather, bad trail guides, and a new cooking style. The Great Irish Famine killed over 1 million people, displaced millions more, and ruined potatoes for everyone emotionally. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, it totally did. While the famine is remembered for mass starvation, disease, and people boarding ships to America with little more than a prayer and a moldy turnip, there are also horrifying whispers of cannibalism. Yes, in the most desperate corners of Ireland, some accounts say people turned to grave robbing. Not for jewelry, but for leftovers. Cannibalism during the famine became a symbol of utter collapse, a point where civilization no longer bothers with things like forks, dignity, or laws about eating Kevin. Just like your uncle's fishing stories, however, some of these tales may be exaggerated. Historians debate the prevalence, with some saying it was a rare, tragic occurrence, and others arguing it was mostly anti-Irish propaganda spread by newspapers trying to sell papers and racism. Regardless, the narrative stuck. Victorian authors painted the famine as Gothic horror, complete with skeletal mothers, brain-hungry children, and starving peasants gnawing at their own family tree. Was there really cannibalism? Hard to say, but the sheer level of suffering was so unimaginable, it became easy for people to believe the unthinkable. In the late 1800s, Ethiopia hit a streak of disasters so brutal it felt like someone drop-kicked the Old Testament straight into East Africa. They called it Kifu Ken, or Evil Days, which is a really gentle way of saying biblical hellscape. It all started when a cattle virus stowed away in Italian imported livestock. Isn't colonialism grand? It wiped out 90% of Ethiopia's cattle. And no cows meant no food, no farming, no transport, no trade, no nothing. Then came droughts, locusts, army worms, cholera, smallpox, and of course, a dash of civil war to really round out the suffering stew. By the end, 1/3 of the population was dead. And yes, in that desperation, cannibalism happened. Back in Europe, readers devoured the reports like true crime newsletters. Ethiopia's suffering became Victorian entertainment. The OG doom scroll, morbid tales of famine-fed cannibalism were spun into moral parables. Don't sin, eat your gruel, and never trust imported goats. But this wasn't metaphor. It was a man-made disaster, worsened by imperial indifference, poor infrastructure, and zero global aid. Because here's the thing, when systems break, morality doesn't politely wait in line. It crumbles. And it's not because people are evil. It's because hunger doesn't care about ethics. In other words, emergency food systems are important to keep around and properly funded. And while we're on the subject of colonial fallout, let's talk about John Williams. No, not the guy who wrote the Star Wars theme. A British missionary who, along with fellow missionary James Harris, was literally eaten for his sins in 1839. The two men sailed to Erromango Island, part of what is now Vanuatu, armed with Bibles, ego, and absolutely no understanding of boundaries. They were there to save souls, but the locals remembered a very different kind of foreign visit, one that involved European traders abusing and exploiting them. So when John and James came ashore with their sanctified sales pitch, the islanders were like, oh, hell no. We've seen this movie before, and in a move that would horrify the Victorians and deeply satisfy your inner justice gremlin, they totally killed and ate those dudes. Williams' remains were shipped to Samoa like a cursed Amazon return, and his wife later had a memorial built for him. Probably the only tombstone in Britain that doubles as a Yelp warning for tropical islands. Back in Europe, the incident fueled the myth of the Cannibal Islands, giving colonizers the perfect excuse to ramp up civilizing missions, by which we mean more land grabs and cultural erasure. In 1884, the Mignonette, a yacht sailing from England to Australia, was shipwrecked in the South Atlantic. The 4-man crew escaped in a lifeboat, with no food, no water, and no plan except, we got this! After 16 days of baking in the sun and sipping seawater like it was a cocktail, the men were, to put it lightly, not thriving. And so they did what any Victorian maritime horror story demands. They ate the cabin boy. His name was Richard Parker, and he was sick, weak, and 17 years old. He didn't volunteer, but Dudley and Stevens killed him, with Brooks apparently playing the I'm not touching this card. It was survival cannibalism, a long unspoken rule that if things get bad enough, you eat the weakest. Morally horrifying? Absolutely. But legally justified? Until then, kinda. But once the men were rescued and returned to England, the courts were like, excuse us, you did what? Thus began the legendary legal case, R v. Dudley and Stevens, the moment British law decided to draw a hard line, in the water. Their defense? We had to. It was necessary. The court's response? Necessity is not a defense for murder, my dudes. Dudley and Stevens received a death sentence, but it was quickly commuted to 6 months in prison, which we imagine they were pretty jazzed about. Still, the case set a landmark legal precedent that you can't just kill someone because you're hungry. In 1837, the Portuguese schooner Arrogante was caught hauling over 330 enslaved Africans, most of them children, across the Atlantic, despite Portugal officially outlawing the slave trade a year earlier. When the British Navy captured the vessel near Cuba, the freed survivors told a story so grotesque, even hardened abolitionists blinked twice. According to multiple testimonies, the crew of the Arrogante didn't just abuse their captives. They killed one, cooked his flesh, and forced the others to eat it. Oh, and for themselves? The crew allegedly reserved the heart and liver, because nothing says supremacy like eating organ meat. To be clear, this wasn't starvation-induced survival cannibalism. This was terror as a weapon, a show of dominance so dehumanizing it made the Atlantic smell even worse than usual. The enslaved survivors reported these stories when they reached Jamaica. Their accounts were detailed, consistent, and horrifying. But colonial justice had a simple way of resolving the matter. They deemed the white crew believable, and the African children, well, not so much. The Jamaican authorities did the colonial equivalent of a shrug, and no one was charged. Justice didn't just look the other way. It walked out, locked the door, and lit a cigar. Ironically, throughout the entire slave trade, European colonizers loved to frame Africans as cannibalistic savages. It was a go-to justification for conquest. Look at these people, they need saving. But in the Arrogante case, the script flipped. It was the white crew doing the eating. And suddenly, nobody wanted to talk about it. Historian Manuel Barcia called this an alarming reversal, a moment when the mask slipped, revealing that barbarism wasn't in the so-called uncivilized, but in their captors. Maybe the ship should have been called the Christian White Arrogante.
Queen Victoria ruled England. It was an era of unprecedented technological and social change, but it was also an era of unrelenting hardship and cruelty that forced the most downtrodden folks to work some bizarre and unsafe jobs to survive. So, today we're going to take a look at some of the craziest Victorian-era occupations. Okay, everybody working for the weekend, which didn't exist back then. In the Victorian era, leeches were used to treat everything from ordinary ailments like fatigue and hemorrhoids to more exotic conditions, like nymphomania. Not sure what a leech is going to do for that specific affliction, but they were willing to give it a shot. Leeches were considered an incredibly versatile treatment, with one small catch. They have no medicinal benefit whatsoever. They're just wet parasites. But the fact that they didn't work doesn't mean they weren't big business. In fact, there was a period of time where belief in their powers was so strong that demand for leeches actually outstripped the supply. Out of this demand rose a new occupation, the leech collector. The collectors, who were usually women, would ride in boats with their feet in the water or just wade bare-ankled into a leech-filled lake, using themselves as bait for the bloodsuckers. The leeches would attach themselves to the collectors, who would then pluck them off and sell them to local doctors. Grisly, but efficient. Unsurprisingly, this method came with some complications. First off, people have a finite amount of blood, and most doctors agree that blood is best left inside the body. Leech collectors often suffered from being chronically low on blood, and wading into stagnant waters with open sores all over your legs resulted in frequent infections and often attracted other parasites that were far more harmful than leeches, and, even worse, much less valuable in the resale market. The leech collectors eventually overfarmed the species of leech used in medicine, heavy air quotes there, causing it to go all but extinct, and the leech collecting profession pretty much disappeared along with it. A lot of people hate their job, but were willing to bet those people would feel differently if the alternative was to be toshers. Toshers were sewage scavengers that hunted through a city's poop canals looking for valuables that got flushed down the toilet. Metal, cutlery, and bones could be recovered, all of which had resale value. And for some reason, a fair amount of stray currency managed to find its way into the sewer too. Was this a result of the wallet chain not yet being invented? Or were people actually eating money? We may never know. Despite the less than ideal working conditions, toshers managed to make a relatively decent living. They raked in what would today be about £20,000 per year, which was enough to put them amongst the upper echelons of Victorian England's working class. Except for obvious reasons, the job carried an exceptionally high risk of illness and infection, and no one should have to put up with that crap. Matchstick maker doesn't sound like a particularly off-the-wall occupation. After all, we use matches today, so somebody's still making them. But the job has changed a bit since Queen Victoria's day. While these days matches are safely manufactured inside big factories that adhere to governmental safety regulations, they used to be made by hand with zero oversight of any kind. The conditions in the matchstick factories were cramped and inhumane. The days were ridiculously long, and the gig didn't even pay a living wage. But that wasn't the worst of it. Matches are made out of some highly volatile chemicals like yellow phosphorus that really shouldn't be handled or inhaled by humans. Prolonged exposure to phosphorus can lead to phosphorus necrosis of the jaw, a condition known colloquially as phossy jaw. Despite the nickname, the condition did not make your jaw good at musical theater. The truly horrific list of symptoms that come with the ailment include extreme pain, tooth loss, bone decay, facial abscesses, and a rotting stench, and curing it requires a total removal of the jaw. The mixers, dippers, and boxers of the factory, usually women and children as young as 8 years old, worked constantly in poorly ventilated conditions with the deadly yellow phosphorus. They breathed it in, got it on their hands, in their eyes, in their mouths, and even in their food, because they often weren't even allowed to take their meal breaks outside of the factory walls. These and other factors led to the London Matchgirl Strike of 1888, which resulted in somewhat better conditions, such as switching to the less deadly red phosphorus that's used today. If you were worried that there was only one way for Victorian-era children to die of respiratory damage, you can relax now. Plenty of kids also got sent to work in coal mines as nippers, where they could really blacken up their lungs. One of the many dangers of working in a mine are the occasional noxious gases that go swirling around, killing miners and small birds. To prevent the spread of these gases, airlocks were built with massive ceiling doors, and nippers were the little guys whose job it was to open those doors for the carts and horses. In addition to the usual falls, fires, and cave-ins that could beset any miner, because of their specific duties, nippers were often crushed by horses, gates, carts, and, of course, the gigantic doors themselves. Thankfully, while coal mines still exist, reforms in the industry mean that children can no longer be sent to work in them, at least not without a note from their parents. Victorian streets were, to say the least, notoriously foul. Meanwhile, the Victorian aristocracy were fussy and well-dressed, to the point of comedy. To serve these two competing forces of cleanliness and filth came the crossing sweeper. The crossing sweeper was usually a very young or very old person who would sweep the filth out of the way for wealthy people crossing the street in exchange for a small sum of money. And we mean very small. Crossing sweepers established their own territories, which led to actual turf wars between sweeper syndicates. Geez, where is that Netflix series? Founded by Viennese Dr. Franz Joseph Gall, phrenology was the theory that the physical shape and characteristics of the head were predictive of a person's personality and intellect. Phrenology took off in popularity during the early 1800s and spawned a cottage industry, despite the fact that it has no basis in medical science. Doctors set up practices that became so popular that many employers required prospective employees to submit to a phrenological assessment before they were hired. Head readers opened shops or went door-to-door peddling their services, and so-called fowlers, named after two popular phrenologist brothers, would travel the countryside giving lectures and demonstrations. Despite what the job title sounds like, pure collectors did not go door-to-door gathering up water filters. That's because pure in this case means dog poop. So yes, in the Victorian era, you could cash paychecks as a person who went around gathering up all the stray dog booms you could find. It probably doesn't sound like much of a living, but at the time, the tanning industry used dog waste as an integral part of the leather curing process. The astringent alkaline qualities of the poo was thought to purify the animal hides, hence the name pure collector. Modern consumers have a very different standard for the word purity. Pure collectors, who were mainly women and the infirmed, were paid by the stinky bucketful and would scour the streets searching for fresh deposits. They would also go to kennels and volunteer to clean them out for the owners. Another entry on the cool titles for terrible jobs list is resurrectionist, an occupation that sounds much more professional than grave robber or body snatcher, which is what the job actually was. You see, at the time, it was illegal to use cadavers for scientific purposes, except for those of executed criminals. This was a problem because medical school policies during the era stated that every student must dissect a human body in order to graduate. Yeah, so you can probably see where this is going. There were far more medical students than executed criminals, which led to a small industry of resurrectionists. Young fellows with nothing but ambition, a shovel, and perhaps a shortage of decency would steal the bodies of the recently deceased and sell them to medical schools, who didn't seem too interested in asking questions about where these bodies were coming from. Corpses weren't considered to be the property of anyone specifically, so as long as the resurrectionist didn't steal any valuables from the casket, everything was more or less cool. And when there weren't enough fresh cadavers to go around, new ones could always be made. Such was the infamous case of Burke and Hare, who were convicted of murdering 16 people in order to sell their bodies to the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh. Didn't realize being successful entrepreneurs was against the law. England finally passed the Anatomy Act of 1832, reforming the cadaver laws and effectively putting an entire industry's worth of grave robbers out of business. And as for Burke and Hare, they became the subject of a 2010 movie called Burke and Hare, which starred Simon Pegg as Burke and Andy Serkis as Hare. Rat catcher is about as straightforward a job title as you can get. Victorian England had a problem with rats, and these were the guys that caught them. That said, they had a problem with rats is a pretty drastic understatement. Toward the end of the 1700s, England was virtually overrun by the gray rat, a specific species of vermin that was larger, more aggressive, and more disease-ridden than their black cousins. The catchers were paid for every rat they caught, which they would then either kill or resell to be used in rat fights, which are exactly what they sound like. Rat catching was generally thought of as a lowly occupation, although some folks managed to make a name for themselves. For example, a gentleman named Jack Black, no, not that one, was well known for being Queen Victoria's personal rat catcher. While cleaning the inside of a chimney might not sound that hardcore, chimney sweeps had it rough. Their bodies were typically covered in scrapes, sores, and calluses, which came from the sides of the chimney into which they were lowered. Oh, and also, they were usually about 3 years old. Yeah, you heard that right. Victorian chimneys were no bigger than modern ones. And unless you're Santa Claus, it's difficult to fit a full-grown adult inside them. A master sweep, which is to say one of the lucky few kids who hadn't died of black lung by the time he reached adulthood, would lower his little human Brillo pads into the cramped, sooty confines of the chimney to scrub the carcinogenic buildup off of the chimney walls, and typically breathe them all right in. And it wasn't just black lung that could get you. Children often fell and got stuck, only to succumb to smoke inhalation the next time a fire was started. When the young sweepers perished or got too big to fit down a flue, master sweeps would visit orphanages to find fresh laborers. Some were even known to kidnap children and put them to work essentially as chimney-sweeping slaves. The use of child labor in dangerous professions and the employment of children under the age of 14 was eventually outlawed in Britain in the 1930s. The Victorian Era, which lasted throughout most of the 19th century, isn't exactly known for its easygoing attitude about social conventions, and death was no exception. During this period, elaborate mourning rituals became the norm, and those who didn't follow these highly regimented grief practices were socially shamed. So, today, we're going to take a look at the bizarre ways people from Victorian England mourned the dead. These days, commemorating the dead mostly involves putting on dark clothing and saying a few nice things about the life of the deceased. But when it came to memorializing the dead, the Victorians were not afraid to do things that would be considered a little unconventional by modern standards. As those who saw our video about how Victorians spent their free time already know, commemorating the dead was extremely popular during the Victorian era. In fact, portions of the deceased hair would be often clipped off and turned into jewelry, like brooches, lockets, rings, watch fobs, and wreaths. But what if a family wasn't particularly crafty, or were too sad to create these things themselves? No worries. If a family couldn't manage it for themselves, they could always send the hair off to an artisan who would do it for them. Failing that, a lock of the deceased hair could always be simply placed in a scrapbook. Anyway, to be completely fair, human hair brooches aren't really that strange considering this was the same society that made fans out of preserved birds, contorted taxidermied cats into humans posing for photographs, unwrapped mummies for fun, and made public visits to the morgue. In modern times, we're accustomed to receiving fancy invitations to events like weddings and sweet 16s. But the Victorians took the use of stationery to a whole other level. That is, they would often send out fancy funeral invitations to close friends and members of the family. Just like today, death notices and obituaries were published in newspapers during the Victorian era. But it would be near impossible to know whether all the right people would see the death notice or read the obits on the right day. This was especially so for those loved ones who lived out of town and might not even get the same newspaper. The funeral invitations were typically written on black-bordered stationery and sent in matching envelopes. At one point, people even petitioned the United States Postal Service to create a special mourning stamp just for these purposes. Stamps were usually printed in bright, cheerful colors and didn't exactly seem appropriate for the occasion. The Victorians had some pretty strict social expectations regarding women grieving over their lost husbands. For the morally upright and respectable Victorian widow, there existed 3 distinct mourning stages, all of which had to be observed before a widow could move on with her life. The first, called deep mourning, required a widow to wear a black dress and veil, known as widow's weeds, for a year and 1 day after her husband's death. You might think that's enough, but there were actually still 2 full stages to go. The next period, called second mourning, lasted for 9 to 12 additional months. During this time, she could take off the veil, but still had to primarily wear black. This was already 21 to 24 months after the husband's death, and there's still another stage to go. The third and final stage, known as half mourning, lasted for another 6 months. Women in this period of mourning could wear colored clothing with black accents, but nothing too gaudy. Finally, after a period of 27 to 30 months, the widow could go back to wearing whatever she wanted. Of course, by that point, all of her clothes were probably out of style. The rules governing men in mourning were a lot more forgiving than those governing women. For example, unlike widows, a widower could remarry at any time during the mourning process. If he had young children and no adult women in the family, someone had to take care of the children while he worked, so he would choose a new wife. That being said, there were still some rules to follow. On his wedding day, the widower did not have to wear his mourning outfit of a black suit and hat. However, he did have to put them on the very next day, and his new wife had to go into mourning as well, until the customary period ended. Photography was developed during the mid-1800s, so, while this may be hard to imagine in a time when everyone didn't have a high-def camera in their pocket, it was still relatively expensive during the Victorian period. In fact, in many cases, people simply could not afford happy family portraits like they can today. So, when the opportunity for a photograph arose, you had to make the most of it by creating a lasting image of something truly significant in your life, which might actually turn out to be someone else's death. One method of maximizing a photo op was to take a picture with a deceased loved one to commemorate them forever. And when a loved one died, family members would do their best to scrape up the money necessary to have a picture taken with the deceased. This would often be the only photo that existed of their now fractured family. Smile, everybody? Oh, except for you. You're dead. If you heard someone talking about morning biscuits, you'd probably think they were stopping at McDonald's on their way to work. But to the Victorians, it meant something very different. After a funeral, a formal lunch or dinner would be served for the mourners. Those who couldn't attend the meal were given a special funeral biscuit or a cookie called a morning biscuit. These spiced, buttery snacks were wrapped in paper with sad poems, information about the deceased, Bible verses, or prayers on them, and they were tied closed with a black ribbon. The paper was intended to be kept as a funeral souvenir, similar to the prayer cards of today. One of the stranger Victorian death customs involved covering all of the mirrors, portraits, and shiny objects, like vases, in the house with black crepe fabric. This was considered to be a necessary posthumous practice for a number of reasons. For one, covering all shiny things with black fabric effectively put the house into mourning, because shiny things, in all of their inappropriate shininess, were viewed as an insult to the family in mourning. On top of that, the Victorians believed that the dead could appear in mirrors, get trapped there, and beckon other family members to follow them into the afterlife. That is pretty creepy, so it's understandable that covering shiny surfaces to prevent that possibility would be a necessary step. The Victorians had some pretty seriously over-the-top mourning traditions, but tear vials, or lacrimatories, from the word lachrymose, might take the cake. As their name states, they are literally small glass vials with rubber or cork stoppers used for catching the tears of mourners during services for the deceased. During the wake and the funeral, mourners would hold the vials up to their faces in order to catch their tears. After the service, these vials would be presented to the family of the deceased as a way to prove how much that person would be missed. Tear vials were also really handy in helping a mourning family decide how long an appropriate mourning period should be. Basically, once the tears in the vials were all dried up, mourning could cease. So, if you're thinking that all these traditions and practices associated with mourning sound like they would be a lot to remember, you are not alone. Even the Victorians themselves had trouble keeping it all straight. But, luckily for these fastidious and respectable Victorian mourners, a person didn't have to commit all of the rules of mourning to memory. Conveniently enough, there were special published mourning manuals that would outline all of the rules for you. One of the many effects of the Industrial Revolution on Victorian society was the advent of industries specifically created around mourning customs. As part of this, books were published and distributed that contained details about how to properly mourn. These books contained sections on clothing, manners, food, and behaviors, among other things. Whether the deceased was on his way to the funeral home for embalming or off to the church for the funeral ceremony, he could not be removed from the home head first. Instead, it was essential that he go out feet first. The Victorians believed that if the dead were removed head first, they would use the opportunity to beckon family members, insisting one of their relatives follow them into death, something which clearly wouldn't work if they were being carried the other way. It makes sense, if you really wanted to. Although funeral homes did exist during the Victorian period, they weren't the one-stop shopping death service parlors that exist today. In fact, they were mainly just places where a body was embalmed. Services weren't held in them. Instead, the deceased body was placed in a casket and then displayed in the parlor of his or her home. Friends, neighbors, and relatives would visit to say goodbye and to comfort grieving loved ones. And some combination of people would be with the body, holding vigil 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, until it was interred. Embalming had been around for centuries, but, Egyptian mummies notwithstanding, truly effective modern embalming had not yet been perfected by the Victorian era. In fact, they were still using arsenic as a preservative at that point. As a result, fresh flowers were needed around the body at all times in order to mask the pungent aroma of a body decomposing. There were no air conditioners at the time, so a summertime wake was in special need of the aromatic service that flowers provided. Although flowers continued to be associated with funerals as a token of respect, they no longer served the dual purpose of the Victorian period. Victorian customs dictated that someone had to sit alongside the body of the deceased the entire time that he or she was laid out in the home. There are many reasons for this, including the idea that it comforted the dead and helped them better transition to the afterlife. More practical ideas for this constant vigil involved the need to keep rodents away from the body, to be near just in case the deceased wasn't truly dead, and to greet anyone who traveled a long way to pay their respects, arriving at an odd hour. Mourning rituals weren't just for adults to follow. Children had to wear mourning clothing and follow a certain set of behaviors as well. If the child was under the age of 12, he or she could wear regular clothing, but had to include a black armband during the winter months, or a gray one during the spring and summer, as well as matching clothing accents. As for children over the age of 12, they wore standard mourning clothing that was the same as the adults. In 1858, centuries of dumping raw human, animal, and industrial waste directly into the River Thames came back to haunt the City of London in the form of the Great Stink. The smell was so bad it could cause vomiting in people miles downwind, but it would also eventually lead directly to the construction of London's first modern sewer system. Today, we're going to take a look at some nausea-inducing facts about London's famous Great Stink. Prior to 1858, London's primitive sewer systems, to put it mildly, were in terrible condition. Delicious raw sewage was emptied directly into cesspits, large tanks, or even just deep holes in the ground. When they filled up, they were designed to overflow into the streets via crude culverts. Oh yeah, poopy runoff. The culverts then emptied into large trenches which just ran down the street, even on major thoroughfares. And if that doesn't sound delightful enough, the waste in the pits would occasionally seep through the soil and find its way into the basements and foundations of homes. This created the risk of too much methane becoming trapped in air pockets, which could, and sometimes did, cause explosions. But some waste did actually make it all the way to the sewer system, which was a good thing. Right? Well, no, because the sewer funneled directly into the Thames River, as well as several other sources of drinking water. Yeah, they were drinking their own wastewater. This extremely disgusting situation is very likely what caused the cholera outbreaks of 1832, 1849, and 1854, in which many thousands of Londoners died. Advances in technology are often a mixed blessing. Such was the case with flush toilets, which had quickly become a luxury among cramped city dwellers who were used to going all the way to their basements to use the bathroom. However, their proliferation put an enormous new strain on an already outdated and overtaxed sewer system. Cesspits were designed to contain an average home's waste, but the new flush toilets were also pumping water into those holes. This made them more likely to flood homes, which increased the risk of various diseases. Eventually, the cesspits were connected to the city's sewer system, which, being designed to handle rainwater, emptied directly into the Thames. So you're probably wondering why Londoners decided to dump their dung into their drinking water. Good question. To be fair, they didn't realize they were doing it. Starting in the 1600s, the city funneled the excrement, as well as other delightful things like industrial waste and animal carcasses, into the Thames under the belief it would be all washed out to sea. The problem was, none of that actually happened. Part of the Thames is what's called a tideway, which means that it's an area affected by the tides. Therefore, any of the waste and sewage that was dumped into the river could be carried back or forth along its length, spreading in either direction. All of that waste built up in the river for centuries, and by 1858, the entire city of London was sitting on ground that was saturated with sewage. When the heat wave hit, it all bubbled back up to the surface. As early as 1855, the problem had started to become evident, and the famous scientist Sir Michael Faraday wrote a letter to the Times of London to call attention to the dire conditions. In the letter, he described a simple experiment he had performed to test the river's opacity. On a sunny day, he went to the river with some white paper cards. He tore up the cards and moistened them so that they would sink below the surface. Then he walked along the bank and dropped some of the paper pieces into the water at every pier he came to. Again and again, the results were the same. The paper bits became invisible before they had even sunk an inch below the surface. While performing the experiment, he also observed that in the vicinity of bridges, the human waste rolled up in clouds so dense that they were visible at the surface. Faraday noted that the stink was common to the whole river, which was basically just a giant open sewer at that point. Emphasizing that his descriptions weren't exaggerated or figurative in any way, he pleaded with the authorities to do something. By 1858, the Thames was in an utterly horrific state. There had been no meaningful changes to the sewer system in years, and a rise in the population had caused an increased amount of waste to be dumped into the river. At the same time, it was still the city's main source of drinking water. No one was really making any efforts to clean it up, and even if they had, it's not clear what might have been done short of building an entirely new sewer for the whole city. Hundreds of years of human and animal waste, garbage and industrial byproduct had turned their water thick, brown, and opaque. Only a few years earlier, Sir Michael Faraday warned Londoners that if we neglect this subject, then a hot season will give us sad proof of the folly of our carelessness. Despite his very specific warning, they would neglect the subject, and the great stink would soon prove him right. As anyone who's ever seen a disaster movie knows, ignoring the dire warnings of a panicked scientist seldom leads to anything good. In this case, it led to June of 1858, when a heat wave descended on London, and an accompanying dry spell made the Thames River nearly stop flowing. The summer heat cooked the fetid water, and the entire city was consumed by the stench. It was so overpowering that it was blamed for illnesses among the upper classes, and townsfolk miles away were reported to start vomiting whenever the wind changed in an unfavorable direction. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli described the river at the time as a Stygian pool reeking with ineffable and unbearable horror. Man, the British are really good at beautifully articulating something that smells terrible. It wasn't until the water dried up that it became apparent how much waste was really in it. It wasn't just sewage either. The river was clogged with offal, industrial waste, dead animals, street runoff, animal feces, leftover parts from slaughterhouses, rotten food, and literally centuries of putrefied garbage. The dry spell had brought it all to the top, and the heat wave had it fermenting in the sun. The people of London tried to get around town by using scented handkerchiefs and various other measures, but they weren't effective. Even Queen Victoria herself, namesake of the whole era, couldn't escape the stink. On one attempted cruise of the river, she tried to mask the stench by pressing a bouquet of fresh flowers against her nose. She only lasted a few minutes before ordering the boat to be turned around and redocked so she could get off and get as far away from the river as possible. Doctors of the Victorian era subscribed to a now debunked idea called the miasma theory. You may remember this term from our plague videos as well as our Victorian hygiene video. Check them out, they're good. The theory, which was rooted in thinking that went all the way back to the ancient world, held that diseases were caused by bad smells. It was on account of this belief that the city and the medical community focused most of their efforts on covering up the bad smells rather than cleaning the river itself. This was a mistake. For many poor people in London, the Thames was the primary and often only source of drinking water, and they kept using it no matter how bad things got. That meant huge swaths of the population were regularly exposed to bacteria that caused deadly and sweeping outbreaks of illnesses spread by contact with feces, like typhoid and cholera. These early attempts at tackling the problem by covering up the smell had other consequences. For example, at one point, authorities spent a fortune to dump chloride of lime into the river, which they hoped would do the trick. Not only didn't it work, but it wound up adding to the river's toxicity since chloride of lime is, in fact, poisonous. In something of a break for the people of London, Parliament had recently moved into their new offices at the Palace of Westminster, which sat right beside the Thames. The new location meant that for the first time, lawmakers couldn't avoid smelling the river, and it's not for a lack of trying. In fact, their first move was to attempt to cover up the stink by drenching the building's curtains in chloride of lime, but it didn't work. The body even considered relocating from their new home at the palace, but that wasn't practical or popular. Letting the poor and powerless suffer was one thing, but if lawmakers couldn't avoid smelling the river themselves, something would have to be done about it. It took just 18 days for Parliament to pass a bill funding the construction of a brand new sewer that would fix the damage done to the Thames and prevent additional pollution. Parliament placed the task of redesigning the sewers into the hands of an English civil engineer named Joseph Bazalgette. He delivered nothing short of one of the greatest government work projects of all time and was widely credited with saving the city. Constructing Bazalgette's entirely new sewer cost the city the modern equivalent of roughly $300 million. The system, which Bazalgette had designed 2 years prior, consisted of a network of sewers that ran parallel to the Thames River, rather than into it. The waste was carried east of the city before being emptied into the river at a point where it could easily flow out to sea. The project also included the construction of water treatment stations, embankments to prevent further buildup of waste, and the development of alternative sources of fresh water. The action was a huge success. The Thames quickly returned to a healthy condition and deaths attributable to poor water quality plummeted. In fact, the new system was so well designed and efficient, it's still in use to this very day. The Industrial Revolution brought the world technological marvels like the spinning jenny, the coke-fueled furnace, and the steam-powered locomotive. It also brought us flash houses, pickpockets, and roving gangs of child thieves. Today, we're talking about the child gangs of the Industrial Revolution. Before industrialization, most boys were ushered into formal apprenticeships. But technology and a new economy eliminated the old ways of life. New industries disrupted families as men went off to factory towns to look for work. often leaving their children behind to fend for themselves. So it was no wonder that many children went out looking for parental figures. It was a matter of emotional and, more urgently, physical necessity. Unfortunately, many of these children wound up in the protective care of so-called ladsmen, who taught them how to steal in exchange for taking a cut of profits. More often than not, the ladsman's cut hovered around 100%, or more. Work that math out.
Good boy, good boy.
In his novel, Oliver Twist, Charles Dickens expertly crafted a tale from his first-hand knowledge of the child gangs working the streets of London. Just like in the novel, real child gangs generally worked under the auspices of a Fagin-esque ladsman. But as bad as Fagin was, real ladsmen were often much, much worse, forcing their wards into harder crimes or even child prostitution. But if morals or basic human decency weren't an issue, being a ladsman could be a very lucrative career.
Put them all back in the book!
Charles King was one such ladsman, who once made the 2021 equivalent of $34,000 in just 1 week from a single 13-year-old pickpocket. Of course, even if you were the best among them, you'd still have to be cool with referring to yourself as a ladsman. Which sounds like a fan club for the big boy restaurants, but hey, that was some serious shilling. Speaking of child exploitation, rather than letting your kid join a free-roving street gang, a popular alternative for Victorian parents was to send them off to work. It was take your kid to work day, but leave them there in 19th century London, where children as young as 8 years old were made to work grueling hours under horrific and hazardous conditions in factories and mines. Miners being miners. These child workers were expected to work the same as their adult counterparts, upwards of 12-hour days, 6 days a week. And it wasn't uncommon for regular workplace accidents to involve the loss of wages, limbs, or even life. Fortunately, in 1878, Parliament got their act together, no pun intended, and passed the Factory Act, officially barring the employment of any worker under the age of 10. So, baby steps, figuratively and literally. Child pickpockets constantly lived on the edge. If caught by the police, children as young as 7 were routinely tried as adults. In fact, between 1801 and 1836, 103 children under the age of 14 were sentenced to death. Fortunately, every single one of those executions was eventually commuted to lesser sentences on account of the child's age. One thing you could say about Victorian London was that it was surprisingly progressive. Both boys and girls were sentenced to hard labor for relatively petty crimes. Child thieves were often sent to prison yards to break stones or push wooden wheels to power mills. To the best of our knowledge, not one of those kids grew up to be Conan the Barbarian. Other children as young as 10 were regularly shipped off to a burgeoning English penal colony. British convicts, including children convicted of picking pockets, were sent to Australia for 7 or 12-year stints. And in some cases, their Australian vacations were extended for life. Once settled in their new land, the convicted children would enjoy a bloomin' onion, toss a boomerang, and explore the Great Barrier Reef. Not really. But they were locked in chains and forced into hard manual labor. Oy! In some cases, these kids were forced to build the prisons in which they'd spend the rest of their lives. And they couldn't even build the prisons to their own 6 specs. Pimp my cell. Some lucky juvenile thieves, aka those not sentenced to death or worse to Australia, no offense Australia, were simply publicly whipped or flogged. Public whippings were quite the event in Victorian London. Ironically, instead of being deterrents for would-be thieves, they were hotspots for other pickpockets, due to the large crowds and chaotic nature of public violence, especially against kids. But whippings weren't the only popular stomping grounds of child thieves. Racetracks, fairs, markets, and even funerals were also quite popular with the kids. In 1735, a gang of young pickpockets disrupted a funeral service at Whitechapel Church by running in and yelling, "Fire!" Mourners panicked to escape the building, and tons of pockets were picked in the ensuing chaos. Fun times were had by all. In the 1860s, Bow Street Magistrates Court abolished the whipping of children, but there was no kumbaya change of heart. The court reversed course, not because of some newfound humanitarianism, but because the screams of the children were disturbing the peace, and they received too many complaints from the locals. "Hey buddy, can you keep your floggings quieter?" Child thieves were often homeless, so they turned to so-called flash houses for shelter. Flash houses were not some new viral video sensation, but public buildings or pubs where criminals would keep caches of stolen property. Flash houses had seedy reputations for housing drunks and hardened criminals, along with their child thieves. Think of a flash house as a Victorian Mos Eisley. It wasn't uncommon for 30 children, boys and girls, all under the age of 16, to be living under the same flash house roof. Police referred to flash houses as nurseries of crime, since they often served as incubators for child thieves to segue into harder, more dangerous crimes, like kidnapping, housebreaking, and even cold, calculated murder. In the mid-1800s, an investigative journalist named James Greenwood wrote that children at the time believed stealing was morally just. They have an ingrained conviction that it is you who are wrong, not them, he wrote. In the eyes of the children, their actions couldn't even be described as stealing. Greenwood reported that the children believed the quote, "You are wrong in the first place in appropriating all the good things the world affords, leaving none for them but what they steal." You may not agree, but at least they had a clear ethos. But it wasn't all about making a living, or even a moral point. Some child thieves were in it just for the thrill, or perhaps that was just an added bonus. Children often bragged about their activities, including one young orphan who told a reporter that picking pockets is the daringest thing that a boy can do. Now that's adorable. Stealing wasn't the only option for the homeless and hungry children of the Industrial Revolution. They could always test the generosity of their community by begging. Of course, begging itself was illegal, and a crime for which even a small child could be thrown into jail. Children convicted of begging were at the very bottom of the prison hierarchy. Child beggars were the constant butt of jeers and ridicule. It was common belief among child thieves that stealing was necessary to build character. Beggars were thought to be morally weak, and that ridicule often meant that the next time that child got locked up, it wouldn't be for begging. Children of the working class in 19th century London had it rough. If they weren't working alongside their parents in factories all day, they were most likely out on the street, in jail, in Australia, or in a disease-ridden flash house. Speaking of the disease, even though the first successful smallpox vaccine was administered in London almost 100 years prior, the Great Pandemic of 1870 sent smallpox cases soaring. The panic that followed led Parliament to enact the Vaccination Act of 1871, which made vaccination mandatory. Parents who did not vaccinate their children were penalized with fines or imprisonment. Unfortunately, even with these precautions, between 1870 and 1980, smallpox went on to claim the lives of an additional 500 million people. In 1880, the Education Act introduced compulsory schooling for children ages 5 to 12, but it was not popular with everyone. Many factory owners feared the loss of revenue with the removal of their never-ending source of cheap labor. However, with the simple mathematics and English that the children acquired, factory owners soon realized that when the children returned to the factories at the age of 13, they were now skilled laborers who could read and make measurements. Profits went up and the education put the children right back where they came from. But at least now, the children of the poorer classes had viable alternatives to thievery or jail. And with the knowledge they received, they had a chance, albeit a small one, in upward social and economic mobility in Victorian England.
Queen Victoria looms large over most of the 19th century. When she died at 81, the Queen left secret, detailed instructions on how to handle her body and what items to place in her coffin. And because royals never hear the word no, some of those items were downright bizarre. So, today we're taking a deep dive into all the weird stuff in Queen Victoria's coffin. But not a literal dive. Who's ready for the worst scavenger hunt in history? At the time of her death, Queen Victoria was Britain's longest reigning monarch. She lived a life full of responsibilities, love, and intrigue. But her 9 children were often in vehement opposition to some of the ways Victoria lived her life, and resentful of those with whom she was closest. So when it came time for the Queen to make her final arrangements, she knew her wishes would require an element of secrecy so they could be observed, especially the things Queen Victoria wanted to be buried with. At the end of her life, Victoria summoned her secretary, who was also her chief lady-in-waiting, and dictated 12 pages of specific instructions regarding her funeral and burial. The lady-in-waiting hand-delivered the instructions to the Queen's physician, Sir James Reed. According to author Tony Rennell, a Reed family descendant wrote a book on the doctor and his famous patient, but the contents of the secret instructions were forbidden by the Royal College censors. When Rennell was invited by the Reed family to research their archives, he came across the hidden instructions written just before Victoria's death. He was able to successfully publish his research, and for the first time, Victoria's final wishes came to light. So it was her doctor who followed through with all her wishes. He was the lone person who knew how Queen Victoria died. He nursed her day and night during her final moments, and it was his name she spoke as she expired. And he followed through with each of her requests, no matter how bizarre. One of the first strange items on Victoria's list was a plaster cast of Prince Albert's hand, made shortly after his death. When her husband Albert died unexpectedly at age 42, Victoria was devastated. Her approach to his loss was an enormous inspiration to grieving people across the Western world. For example, she's a big reason why we associate the color black with being in mourning. But the Queen took things a bit further. For years after his death, she had Albert's former servants attend to his mourning rituals. Servants brought hot water, his shaving brush and cup, and towels to his room every morning. His valet also continued to bring in the suit he would wear that day. At the end of the day, the servants would return and remove the items, only to repeat the same the next day, and the next. Like a British remix of The Sixth Sense, Victoria kept her bedroom draped in black and decorated with Albert's visage in photos and portraits. She slept nightly with the plaster cast of his hand, like a teddy bear in a Tim Burton movie. She probably figured it was only fitting that she sleep with it eternally. In a macabre mixture of death and birth, Queen Victoria's secret instructions demanded her entire funeral, from horses to mourning attire, be clad in white. She also insisted she be buried wearing the white bridal veil from her 1840 wedding to Prince Albert. Listen, she was really into that guy. In fact, it was the young monarch Victoria who broke earlier traditions and began the custom of wearing entirely white wedding gowns. Her choice came partly from a desire to symbolize her purity, as both she and Albert were inexperienced lovers on their wedding night. Today, pretty much every wedding dress is white. At the end, perhaps Victoria returned to her white bridal veil as a symbol of the happiest relationship of her life and of her hope that she would join Albert in heaven, where she could also maybe hang out with Jimi Hendrix. Here's where Victoria's instructions for what should be placed in her coffin became a little complex. While her family knew that she asked to be buried wearing her wedding ring, only the Queen's secretary and physician knew that she wanted to be buried wearing a second wedding ring on her left ring finger. This ring was given to her by a man other than her husband, a man she came to know very well during the 40 years she lived after Albert's death. Victoria's relationship with Scottish servant John Brown was extremely controversial, particularly within the British royal family. She had sent for him during the early years of her widowhood, since she remembered that Prince Albert had spoken very highly of Brown. The Queen and the Gillie, that's a Gaelic term for servant, became close friends. He was the only person in Victoria's orbit who could get away with criticizing her and speaking to her in a familiar tone. Author Tony Rennell brought to light the story of the second wedding ring, and more recently, historian A.N. Wilson argued that Victoria and Brown did indeed have a romantic relationship, but that it was never consummated. According to Wilson, they slept in the same bed, but just hugged on one another. Yeah, whatever you say, pal. Wilson also points to a deathbed confession of a Scottish minister who claimed he had secretly married the couple. Whatever their relationship or marital status, the Queen's children utterly despised Brown and were angry with their mother for the rest of her life, even after Brown's death. So angry was Victoria's son and heir King Edward VII that once his mother was good and buried, he removed or had destroyed every monument and mention of John Brown at all royal properties. What the new king didn't know was that his mother was laid to rest clutching her favorite photo and a lock of hair from her beloved John Brown, and wearing Brown's mother's wedding ring on her finger. So, who's gonna tell him? Queen Victoria was buried in a sea of sentimental souvenirs amid a variety of flowers. Her daughter-in-law, Alexandra of Denmark, brought fresh hyacinths to the casket before it was sealed, and Victoria's doctor and confidant, Sir James Reed, used the new Queen Alexandra's flowery gift as a mean to obscure secret items held in Victoria's left hand. Chief among the floral grave offerings was a request made by the Queen herself. She asked that a sprig of heather be placed on her body as it was made ready for burial. The flowering heather is a Scottish symbol, and perhaps served as a remembrance of happy times with her family at Balmoral Castle, as well as of the adventurous time she shared with Scottish servant and companion John Brown. Queen Victoria was laid to rest in the ornate mausoleum she had built years earlier to house her beloved Albert's remains. At his death, she ordered a life-size sculpture of Albert in repose, his head inclining towards a sculpture of his wife, which was placed atop his sarcophagus. Her own matching statue was put in storage to be displayed upon her own death. Victoria in marble repose appears just as she imagined herself even at the end, young and in love. Like that Bryan Adams song. However, when she died 40 years after Albert, everyone had forgotten where her grave statue was stored, which must have been awkward. So the Queen was initially buried without the statue, and it was several months before it was found, boarded up behind a wall in Windsor Castle. Queen Victoria's posthumous instructions were so meticulous that she even planned exactly who she wanted to lift her body into its final resting place. Once her doctor and secretary placed most of the sentimental items into the coffin, certain family members and servants were gathered to move her body from bed to casket. Lifting at her head were the doctor and chief lady-in-waiting. Lifting along one side of her body were her son and heir, the new King Edward VII, her grandson, German Kaiser Wilhelm II, and another of her sons, Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught and Strathern. Lifting on the other side of her body were 3 of her most devoted servants. The coffin was already nearly full of the sentimental items Victoria wanted to keep by her side in death, but her tiny form, just 5 feet tall, was lowered into her collected treasures with room to spare. It was at this moment that her ladies gathered round, assisted by the doctor, to make any necessary adjustments and add a few final secret items. Her relatives and attendants then left the room, which allowed Reed to place John Brown's mother's wedding band on the Queen's left ring finger and tuck her Scottish companion's photo and lock of hair into the same hand. The casket was then sealed shut. Victoria's secret, indeed. Sir James Reed served as Queen Victoria's primary physician for the last 15 years of her life. He was devoted to her, and she to him. Trusting no one in her family with her final wishes, it was only natural for her to turn to him as the keeper of her life's secrets. The detailed instructions prepared by the Queen's secretary still exist. They are held in the possession of Reed's descendants as part of his collection of personal papers, and the royal family isn't happy about it. The late Princess Margaret reportedly confronted members of the Reed family in public, accusing them of having something that belongs to us. Give it back! But the royal demands were unsuccessful, and the list remains in the Reed archive. So, what do you think? What unusual item would you want to be buried with? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.